Imagine opening your eyes one morning, only to realize that almost no one around you questions anything anymore. The pace of the world has become deafening. Information floods every corner of life. And what was once the sharpest tool of the human mind, our ability to think carefully, has dulled into quiet obedience. Consider what happens to a society when reflection fades, when reasoning gives way to reaction, and when curiosity is replaced by slogans and group approval. What you're about to hear is not simply an observation, but a warning. The vanishing of critical thought and the dangerous rise of what many now call collective stupidity. It is a condition in which entire populations fall into shallow thinking, adopt opinions not their own, and surrender their independence of mind while believing themselves free. Stay with me, because before this journey ends, we will arrive at a truth so urgent it could determine whether we reclaim our minds or lose them to systems that prefer us docile and distracted. But first, a moment of honesty. Thinking is not easy. In fact, it has always required effort, courage, and humility. Yet today, it is not only hard, but increasingly discouraged. Our world rewards speed, outrage, and certainty, not contemplation. Algorithms are designed to show you only what affirms your existing beliefs. Schools emphasize memorization and conformity rather than exploration and doubt. As Noam Chomsky observed in his work on propaganda, the manufacturing of consent depends on people consuming without questioning. When agreement becomes habit, when we accept without understanding, we become easier to govern and far easier to deceive. Critical thought, once celebrated as a defining human skill, is now treated as an inconvenience. It slows the pace of digital debates, disrupts echo chambers, and dares to challenge the ideologies people cling to for safety. To simply ask, "But is this true?" has become, in many circles, an act of defiance. And yet, if we fail to ask, we open the door to manipulation and decline. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned after the Second World War that the greatest danger to a free people is not violent tyranny, but the slow numbing of thought, the way ordinary citizens, step by step, stop questioning what they are told. How did we get here? The answer begins with the relentless flood of information we now endure each day. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin noted that the average person processes several times more data daily than anyone could have imagined a generation ago. Every hour we are interrupted by messages, notifications, headlines, and advertisements. The human brain was never built to handle such saturation. When overwhelmed, it takes shortcuts, relying on biases and cues from peers or perceived authorities. Social psychologists call this social proof, the tendency to assume that if many others believe something, it must be correct. But this is not reason. It is a survival instinct. And in the hands of those who understand it, it becomes a powerful weapon of control. Consider how easily ideas spread on social media, not because they are true, but because they are popular. A post with thousands of likes looks persuasive whether or not it rests on evidence. That instinct, to trust the crowd, is why collective stupidity spreads faster than wisdom. People are not unintelligent. They are simply trained to rely on signals rather than thought. The result is a culture where being informed is replaced by appearing informed, and where noise drowns out clarity. This pattern is not new. The Roman poet Juvenal once lamented that the people had surrendered their role in civic life in exchange for bread and circuses, entertainment and distraction. Today, the screens in our pockets serve the same function. They entertain, outrage, and divide, but they rarely invite us to slow down and reflect. The cost of this is immense. A world where millions confuse activity for awareness and reaction for thought. But the true danger lies deeper still, and it is there that we must now go. One of the most troubling changes in recent decades is the collapse of deep attention, reading. Once the cornerstone of critical thought is in decline. Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf has shown how the brain is being rewired by digital habits. Instead of engaging fully with a single argument or narrative, we now skim, jump between tabs, and check our devices constantly. But critical thinking demands sustained focus. You cannot evaluate an idea carefully if your attention is fractured. Ask yourself, When was the last time you read through a book or even a full article without interruption? When was the last time you let a challenging thought sit in your mind long enough to test it? These are not trivial questions, because without the capacity to sustain attention, the possibility of true reflection disappears. Carl Sagan once warned that we live in a society deeply dependent on science and technology, yet dangerously ignorant of both. His concern was not merely a lack of knowledge, but the erosion of the habit of questioning in a culture saturated with opinions, hot takes, and ideological warfare. The quiet act of pausing to think becomes a form of rebellion, and yet this rebellion is desperately needed. Because when thinking collapses, societies grow vulnerable to propaganda and fear. History offers countless reminders. From the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century to the mass hysteria that accompanies every new wave of misinformation today, the roots of this decline stretch back further than digital technology. The education system itself has long been criticized for discouraging independent thought. John Taylor Gatto, a teacher who spent decades observing schools from within, argued that modern education was designed less to cultivate wisdom than to train obedience. Built during the industrial age, compulsory schooling rewarded compliance over curiosity, memorization over exploration. Children were not taught how to think, but what to think. The result? Generations who learned that conformity was safety, and that questioning authority was dangerous. This conditioning does not vanish when we leave school. It continues in workplaces, in communities, and even in our closest relationships. Psychologist Erich Fromm wrote in Escape from Freedom that many people secretly wish to surrender their freedom of thought, because genuine freedom carries responsibility. To think for yourself means you must take ownership of your ignorance, your choices, and your future. For some, that weight is unbearable. It is easier to conform, to hide in the crowd, to repeat what others say. Comfort replaces truth, distraction replaces depth, and simplicity replaces complexity. In this way, silence becomes complicity, not by malice, but by habit. Social media has amplified this vulnerability to unprecedented levels. Platforms are engineered not to encourage truth, but to maximize attention. They feed us content that confirms what we already believe. Reward emotional reactions over reasoned dialogue, and thrive on division. Why reflect when reacting is faster, easier, and rewarded with likes? Philosopher Marshall McLuhan foresaw this decades ago when he wrote, "The medium is the message. The way we receive information transforms the way we think." Today's mediums prioritize speed, certainty, and outrage, qualities that actively weaken our capacity for reflection. The consequences are profound. In this environment, truth itself becomes secondary to virality. What spreads is not necessarily what is accurate, but what is loud, provocative, or emotionally charged. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once observed that the crowd is untruth. In the digital age, his words ring truer than ever. Consensus is mistaken for wisdom, and repetition for evidence. A dangerous illusion takes hold. If enough people agree, it must be right. This is not just intellectual laziness, it is the very foundation of collective stupidity. So where do we begin to resist? It starts with questions. The kind of questions that pierce the surface and force us into depth. What assumptions shape the way I see the world? Who profits when I believe what I am told? How often do I truly listen to ideas I disagree with? Not to attack them, but to understand. These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary. For as Socrates reminded us, the unexamined life is not worth living, and in our time, the unexamined mind is the easiest to control. To understand why so many intelligent people fall into shallow thinking, we need to look inside the human mind itself. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow, explained that our brains operate in two modes, one fast, instinctive, and emotional, the other slow, deliberate, and analytical. In a high-speed culture, most people live in the fast mode. Snap judgments feel efficient, but they come at the cost of depth. The slow mode, the one required for true reflection, takes effort, time, and patience, qualities that modern life discourages. When the pace of society leaves little room for pause, our capacity to think carefully atrophies. This makes us especially vulnerable to manipulation. Politicians, advertisers, and media outlets all know how to package complex issues into simple binaries. They exploit our mental shortcuts by repeating messages until they feel familiar. Once we accept something as true, confirmation bias takes hold, and our brains defend the belief even when evidence contradicts it. Think of how conspiracy theories spread, or how propaganda during wars has convinced millions to accept obvious distortions. The danger is not that people are irrational, but that they are unaware of how much emotion shapes what they believe. Another powerful trap is groupthink. Social psychologist Irving Janis documented how even highly intelligent groups make disastrous decisions when dissent is silenced. From political blunders like the Bay of Pigs invasion to corporate collapses like the Challenger disaster, history shows that the desire for harmony often outweighs the search for truth. People suppress doubts because questioning the group feels unsafe. Consensus becomes more important than clarity. And yet, without dissent, mistakes multiply. To resist this requires more than intelligence. It requires courage. The courage to be the lone voice, to withstand ridicule, and to endure isolation. History honors those who had that courage. Galileo stood before the Inquisition and declared that the earth moves. Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution, knowing it would challenge both science and faith. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that in individuals, insanity is rare. But in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. Martin Luther King Jr. dared to dream of a reality that contradicted the accepted order of his time. These figures were mocked, rejected, or punished for their defiance. Yet their refusal to submit to collective ignorance reshaped human history. But courage has always come at a cost. To think critically in a society that punishes doubt is an act of rebellion. You risk misunderstanding, exclusion, even hostility. Yet what you gain is something far more valuable: self-respect and clarity. Your beliefs are no longer borrowed from the crowd. They become your own. There is a quiet power in this, a strength that does not need validation, because it rests on the solid ground of honest inquiry. Why, then, do so many people choose not to think? Beyond convenience, there is fear. Thinking critically means confronting uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the ego. It is easier to defend a fixed belief than to admit you may be wrong. It is easier to embrace identity, political, cultural, or religious, than to face the silence of not knowing. In today's world, identity has become sacred, and to challenge an idea is often mistaken for an attack on the person who holds it. This illusion that we are our opinions destroys the very possibility of dialogue. The psychologist Carl Jung once observed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. This is as true today as it was in his time. We avoid thinking because to question deeply is to encounter not just new ideas, but ourselves, our hidden motives, our fears, and the fragility of our beliefs. Yet this confrontation is precisely where freedom begins. For as long as our minds remain shielded by illusions, we remain bound to the patterns others impose on us. The question is no longer whether society discourages thinking, it clearly does, but whether you are willing to pay the price of truth. Because once you step onto this path, there is no return, and the choice to begin lies entirely in your hands. At the heart of this crisis, beneath the noise of media and the failures of institutions, lies a truth most people are unwilling to face. The disappearance of critical thinking is not because people are incapable of it, but because they are afraid of what it might reveal. To think carefully is to risk dismantling the very structures that give us comfort, our identities, our tribes, our cherished beliefs. In a world where belonging feels essential, questioning has become dangerous. That is why so many prefer certainty over curiosity, slogans over inquiry, and conformity over solitude. Yet the paradox is clear. The more tightly we cling to our identities, the less we actually know ourselves. This illusion that we are nothing more than our opinions and affiliations is precisely what enslaves us. You are not your political party, your religion, or your social group. You are a human being with the capacity to learn, evolve, and transform. True growth begins the moment you detach your worth from your current beliefs and open yourself to the possibility of change. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti wrote, "To understand the immeasurable, the mind must be extraordinarily quiet." That quietness is where truth emerges, not in noise, not in performance, but in stillness. To reclaim critical thinking is to embrace a discipline, even a kind of spiritual act. It is the willingness to honor truth above comfort, growth above certainty, and freedom above approval. It requires humility. The humility to say, "I don't know," without shame, to sit with difficult questions without rushing to easy answers, to accept that wisdom takes time. It requires practice, reading deeply rather than skimming headlines, listening to those you disagree with rather than dismissing them, pausing before reacting so that thought can catch up with emotion. Above all, it requires courage, the courage to walk alone in a culture that demands conformity. The moment you begin to think critically, you see the world differently. You notice when manipulation is being used to control you. You begin to distinguish between information and propaganda, between education and indoctrination, between authentic connection and empty performance. You learn to pause, to examine, to question not only the world, but also yourself. This shift does not make life easier. It makes it clearer. And clarity, however painful, is the ground on which real freedom is built. When you choose to think, you light a fire. That fire has burned throughout history in the minds of philosophers, scientists, revolutionaries, and truth seekers who refuse to let their thinking be outsourced. It is the same fire that fueled Socrates in the Agora, Galileo at his telescope, and every quiet dissenter who dared to see with their own eyes. This fire is rare, but it is contagious. Each time you resist the urge to conform, each time you ask a harder question instead of repeating what is popular, you push back against the tide of collective stupidity. Do not mistake this path for isolation. You are not alone. There is a quiet revolution happening, not of noise, but of minds, not of outrage, but of awareness. It begins each time one person chooses reflection over reaction, dialogue over division, wisdom over performance. It begins with you, here and now. The choice to awaken is not given by any system or algorithm. It is yours. And once you awaken, you cannot go back. So let this be your reminder. The most radical act you can take today is not to shout louder, not to accumulate more opinions, not to win debates, but to think clearly, deeply, and honestly. In a culture that confuses confidence for competence, that alone is revolutionary. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Choose your colors carefully. Let them not be borrowed from the crowd, but discovered through your own inquiry. If these words resonate, share them, not because they are fashionable, but because they are necessary. Leave your reflections and doubts in the comments, for thought does not grow in silence but in dialogue. And remember, every time you choose clarity over comfort, you reclaim a piece of your freedom. Stay awake, stay curious, and above all, keep thinking.